Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Rome in the year 67 AD and you see something that makes your blood turn cold. The emperor himself, Nero, strolls through the forum with what appears to be his beloved wife at his side, a vision of beauty draped in silk and jewels. But the whispers that follow in their wake carry a truth so disturbing it defies comprehension. That woman holding the emperor's hand was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero did to him represents one of the darkest chapters of human cruelty ever recorded. This isn't just another tale of Roman excess or imperial madness. This is the story of how absolute power can twist love into obsession, grief into horror, and transform a living human being into a breathing monument to one man's shattered mind. To understand what happened to Sporus, we must first understand the man who destroyed him. Nero didn't begin as a monster when he ascended to power at just 16 years old. Rome celebrated the arrival of a golden age. He reduced taxes, funded magnificent public works, and charmed the common people with theatrical performances. But power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls, and by 65 AD, something fundamental had broken inside the young emperor's mind. Perhaps it was the paranoia that comes with knowing everyone around you secretly desires your throne. Perhaps it was the isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, never hear the word no. Or perhaps it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Nero believed he wanted. Beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to match his grandiose vision of himself, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just another pretty face in the imperial court. She possessed sharp political instincts that made her formidable, and when Nero first saw her, he was already married to Octavia in a loveless political arrangement. Poppaea represented everything his wife was not. Where Octavia was quiet and reserved, Poppaea commanded every room she entered. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea reveled in being the center of every gaze. The affair that followed quickly evolved beyond simple adultery into something far more dangerous. Genuine obsession. Ancient historians describe Nero's behavior during this period as increasingly unhinged. He would fly into murderous rages if other men looked at Poppaea too long during public functions. He stationed guards around her constantly, ostensibly for protection, but really to monitor her every movement. He bankrupted the imperial treasury, buying her jewels from India, silks from China, perfumes from Arabia. He divorced Octavia in a shocking political move, then married Poppaea in the most lavish ceremony Rome had ever witnessed. But even marriage couldn't satisfy his need to possess her completely. He began isolating her from friends and family, commissioning dozens of portraits so he could gaze upon her image even when they were apart. Ancient sources tell us Nero would spend hours simply watching her go about daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion. This was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership, who saw another human being not as an independent person but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Then came the day that would haunt Nero forever and seal Sporus's fate. During what started as an ordinary domestic argument, the details vary depending on which ancient historian you believe. Nero lost control in a way that would shatter his world. Poppaea was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps the stress made her bolder in challenging his priorities. According to the most reliable accounts, Nero struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources describe a single devastating blow to her abdomen. Others speak of a sustained attack that left her bleeding on the marble floor. In that terrible moment, the man who commanded 30 legions, who could order anyone executed with a word, who was worshipped as a god in eastern provinces, had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. What followed was described by ancient witnesses as one of the most pathetic scenes in imperial history. Nero threw himself on Poppaea's dying body, alternating between begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned the finest physicians in Rome, offering them fortunes to save her, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Nero's heir. In that moment, something inside the emperor didn't just break, it shattered completely, scattering pieces of his sanity across the marble floors of the palace, and those fragments would soon cut into the life of an innocent young man who had the misfortune of looking like a ghost. If you're captivated by these hidden corners of history where humanity reveals its darkest capabilities, consider subscribing. These stories deserve to be remembered, not just as tales of ancient horror, but as reminders of what happens when power goes unchecked and when one person's pain becomes invisible beneath another's desire. Your support helps keep these forgotten voices alive. The mourning that consumed Nero after Poppaea's death became legendary throughout the empire. He refused to have her body cremated according to Roman custom, instead having it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, established religious cults in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now navigated an even more treacherous landscape where courtiers were expected to participate in the fiction that Poppaea somehow still lived. They referred to her in present tense, left her favorite seat empty at banquets, and anyone who suggested the emperor should move on faced immediate exile or worse. It was during this period of profound illusion that a young man named Sporus first caught the emperor's attention, though he had no idea he was walking straight into a nightmare from which he would never escape. Sporus was probably around 14 or 15 years old, born into slavery within the imperial household and freed as a child. He had been raised within the palace walls, receiving education that prepared him for administrative duties, a position of relative privilege in Roman society. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better conditions than freeborn citizens of lower classes. But this privilege came with absolute vulnerability. They could be elevated to positions of influence or destroyed on a whim, with no legal recourse, no protection, and no one to hear their screams. What made Sporus special in Nero's grief-addled eyes wasn't his intelligence or skills, it was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and in his delicate bone structure. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's fractured mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to resurrect what he had destroyed with his own hands. The resemblance was so striking that Nero may have genuinely believed he was witnessing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one obvious problem: Sporus was male. But for a man who had spent months conversing with a corpse who had convinced himself he was divine, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in recorded history. Nero didn't just decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman. He decided to make the transformation permanent and irreversible. The emperor summoned the finest physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man, purely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation. It was the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity as a human being. The procedure was agonizingly painful and carried enormous risk of death from infection or blood loss. Ancient surgical techniques were primitive, relying on crude instruments and basic anesthetics that did little to numb the horror. Sporus would have been held down by guards while physicians approached with their blades, his screams echoing through palace corridors where no one dared intervene. The surgery lasted hours, and recovery took weeks or months, during which time Sporus would have understood with growing clarity that his life as he knew it was over. He would never father children, never experience normal relationships, never even be considered fully male by Roman society. Everything that defined him had been stripped away to serve one man's delusion. Once Sporus recovered enough to stand, Nero announced something that shocked even the jaded Roman aristocracy. He was going to marry the young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony. The preparations consumed months and enormous resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to special quarters where he could be prepared for his grotesque new role. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe of gowns designed to flatter his surgically altered body and hide any remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating gems that had once adorned Poppaea herself. These weren't just accessories, they were shackles, tangible links to a dead woman, physical reminders of the ghost he was being forced to become. But the physical transformation was only the beginning of Sporus's torture. Makeup artists taught him cosmetic techniques to feminize his features, showing him how to make his eyes appear larger, his cheeks rosier, his angles softer. Hairdressers instructed him in elaborate styling techniques that took hours each day and required heated metal tools pressed dangerously close to his scalp. Perhaps most psychologically devastating were the lessons in feminine behavior. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, gesture, and move through space in appropriately ladylike ways. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt linguistic mannerisms associated with feminine discourse. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this transformation? Every day Sporus looked in mirrors that reflected back a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior reminded him that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman was now a chain binding him to a role he never chose and never wanted. The wedding took place in spring of 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight to the proceedings. Nero spared no expense, treating it as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of history's greatest emperor. The ceremony included all traditional Roman rituals, the exchanging of vows, the joining of hands, the sharing of sacred bread, the signing of legal documents that made this union official in the eyes of the state. Guests played their parts with accomplished acting skills, offering congratulations and expensive gifts while maintaining expressions of appropriate joy. But those who knew the truth understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and profoundly disturbing. The most powerful man in the world was publicly marrying a surgically mutilated teenage boy dressed as his dead wife, and everyone was expected to pretend this was normal. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would a legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, quarters within the palace complex, and income from the imperial treasury. He had his own litter for traveling through Rome's streets, his own retinue of attendants, his own seat at state functions. But all this apparent luxury came with a terrible price. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero everywhere, to sit beside him at dinners, to play the devoted wife in every interaction. And Nero genuinely seemed to believe he had successfully brought Poppaea back from the dead. He would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never happened, and expect responses that maintained the elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every single day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest mistake could mean death. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note that he grew more withdrawn and melancholic as time passed, even as he continued playing his assigned role perfectly in public. This psychological strain is almost impossible to comprehend. Every morning, Sporus woke in rooms decorated to remind him of a woman he'd never met. Every conversation required him to pretend to be someone else, to claim memories and experiences that weren't his own. For over 2 years he lived this bizarre existence, a living ghost haunting the palace alongside the emperor's shattered mind. But in 68 AD, Nero's excesses finally pushed Rome too far. Rebellions erupted across the empire led by governors tired of the emperor's madness. The Praetorian Guard withdrew their support, and the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. When the emperor finally fled Rome with a small group of loyal supporters, Sporus was among them. Even facing death, Nero couldn't leave behind his living reminder of Poppaea. They hid in a villa outside the city while Nero alternated between grandiose escape plans and theatrical preparations for suicide. When word came that his enemies were closing in, Nero finally chose death over capture. But his suicide left Sporus in an incredibly vulnerable position as one of the most visible symbols of the fallen regime. What followed was perhaps even more tragic than what came before. Sporus became political property, passed from one powerful man to another like a valuable trophy. First claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, then by Otho, then by Vitellius. Each new master kept him dressed as a woman, and called him by Poppaea's name, continuing the same degrading performance. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its final unbearable conclusion. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in a reenactment of mythological scenes involving violence and sexual humiliation. For Sporus, who had endured years of psychological and physical torture, this represented the ultimate degradation, being used for the amusement of thousands. His suffering transformed into spectacle. Rather than submit to this final humiliation, Sporus made the only choice that was truly his own in years. He took his own life, probably by poison. Sometime in 69 AD, he was no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his life since the moment Nero decided he looked like a ghost. His story became a cautionary tale whispered through the corridors of power about the dangers of absolute authority and the human cost of imperial madness. But ancient historians seemed less interested in Sporus as a person than as a symbol of decadence, another exotic detail in the catalogue of Nero's crimes. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the abuse Sporus endured, but how he was systematically stripped of identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became instead a canvas for the emperor's twisted fantasies. Every aspect of his appearance, behavior, and existence was rewritten to serve someone else's delusion. And yet, the fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation suggests that somewhere beneath all those layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self survived. In his final act, he reclaimed the one thing that had been taken from him all those years ago: the right to decide his own fate. The story of Sporus forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, identity, and the human capacity for cruelty. It reminds us that behind every historical statistic, every ancient scandal, every footnote about imperial excess, there were real people who suffered in ways we can barely imagine. Sporus wasn't just a victim of one mad emperor, he was a victim of a system that allowed one person's grief and obsession to completely destroy another person's humanity. His story asks us to consider what we owe to those whose suffering has been forgotten, whose names appear only as footnotes in someone else's tragedy, whose pain was considered less important than the spectacle it created. 2,000 years later, we still remember Nero's name, still study his reign, still debate his madness. But how many people know the name Sporus? How many remember the boy who was surgically mutilated and psychologically tortured to serve as a living monument to imperial grief? His story deserves to be more than a footnote, more than a shocking detail in the catalogue of Nero's crimes. It deserves to be remembered as a testament to the darkest capabilities of human nature and the terrible price paid by those who have the misfortune of catching a tyrant's attention. In the comments below, I want to hear your thoughts. Stories like this one force us to confront the worst of what humans are capable of doing to each other. How do we make sense of suffering on this scale? How do we remember victims like Sporus whose stories were nearly erased by history? Share your reflections, because these conversations matter, these stories matter, and the people who lived them, who suffered them, who died because of them, they matter most of all.